Okay, so we are going to talk today about running scaled retrospectives. This is probably one of my favorite subjects and favorite talks to give because hopefully it's very practical for everyone here. And we'll talk about some things you can try and put into practice right away where you work. But there's not a lot of things that you need to kick this off. And hopefully in some cases, if you've got some scaled retro practices already in place, this will just give you some new ideas on things to make them better. So we'll dig in here. So like Carrie said, my name's Colleen Johnson. I'm in Denver, Colorado, so not too far away from you guys. And I am the CEO and founder of Scattersbook, which is an online retrospective tool. My husband and I actually built this tool in 2015, and I was doing a lot of consulting work, and at the time felt like the retros always got canceled because somebody either had the afternoon off or the day off, and we kept moving them and then we would never have them. And I was like, I just want a way to get everybody's info so that if they're not there, we have their feedback. And we didn't really do a whole lot with it. My husband wanted to learn some new technology, so he was playing around with some different dev tools. And then one day we went and looked at the Google Analytics, and like 30,000 people had been using these boards, and we were like, "Whoa! Like we built something people are using." So we last year joined an accelerator program that allowed us both to quit our full-time jobs and go full-time on Scattersbook. I was also telling Kelly at the beginning, it's been a really funny journey to be on this side of product development, right? So all the things we coach teams to do, they're really hard to do when it's your product, right? Our releases are too big, our sprints have too much in them. We're always adding more stuff in and making the deployments impossible. And it's pretty funny to try to eat our own dog food now from a practices perspective. I also recently joined prokanban.org as the CEO there, and we are trying to create a really diverse and inclusive learning community for Kanban. So if you're interested in learning any more about Kanban, we're really closely following scrum.org's model where we've decoupled the classes from the certification exams. So you can also self-study and take the exams there if you're interested in getting a Kanban cert. My most important job ever is to these three, who this picture seems so outdated now. They're 3, 11, and 13. And like the whole house has like a mad case of senioritis. It feels like everybody's just so excited for summer break and to be able to do stuff this summer. I feel like we've planned every inch of our summer out already. So that's exciting. All right, so let's talk retros. This quote came from a director of engineering I was working with, who said, "I had no idea how many teams were struggling with the exact same problem." But what was more important was actually the sentence that came after this. And that was, "This thing is easy to fix. This is an easy problem to fix." And I had a little bit of like an epiphany, a light bulb moment where I was like, why aren't we giving this feedback to leadership more often? Why do we keep our retros kind of tucked away in this black box, right, with the team where we're not bringing things from the retros up the food chain? So for this particular client where this happened, we started doing what we call a retro recap. And at the end of every sprint, all the scrum masters get together and they talk about the themes. And we try to be really careful to not disclose anything that's who said what, or in some cases we try to just keep it very like theme based, right? We're not really breaking the trust or the safety of the team. And while that started with just the scrum masters having this conversation and trying to share notes, all of a sudden leadership started asking to come, if they could come and listen to our conversation about the retros. And then the CIO asked if she could join us and start coming to this retro recap. And again, all of a sudden it was a little bit of a light bulb moment that we had information that we were collecting in the retros that a lot of other people in the organization needed to hear. So let's start at the base here with what is a retrospective. I'm sure everybody here knows, but just for a refresher, our retrospectives are a regular opportunity to use feedback about a product, process, performance as a basis for improvement. So we're using this time together to always try to identify small ways that we can change how we work. When we retro, I think one of the most important things that can come out of that process and that conversation is giving the team ownership over their process and practices. So what you start to see is, especially in an organization maybe where Agile is new, is that over time, all the flavors of team practices end up just slightly different because of their retrospectives. So maybe one team will decide that they want to try WIP limits on their Kanban board, or maybe another team is going to try breaking out their work items in a different way. So you start to see all these little variations that are specific to how the team works and that are coming out of these retros to help the teams adapt and really build their process around the improvements that they want to make. I think the other thing that's really great about retros is the relationship it creates for the team, right? So we start to build a team dynamic about talking about how we're working together, right? I don't know if anybody else has used this term from Seinfeld, but it becomes a little bit of our airing of grievances. It's a safe place to say what's not working or maybe who's not working well, but it's actually very healthy, right? To get all of that out on the table. And I think it creates a stronger team when the teams can start to have some difficult conversations and work through them together. When we think about all of the different levels of feedback in an organization, I like to try to break this down into the different systems that are kind of at play in any big organization. And when we think about retros, a lot of what we're talking about is at the team level here. And if you're working with SAFe, sometimes you'll do an inspect and adapt workshop on your release or on your program increment. So you might be somewhere in the middle here where we've got program or portfolio level retros. And a lot of times those tend to be very event driven. So like I mentioned, something around a release cadence. And then I know some of you have your cameras on or off, but use the reactions, even if your camera's off. For a show of hands, how many of you have ever had an organization level retrospective? Like the whole company has done some kind of retro. I see Steve. Let's see. Scott says yes. We've got two yeses. Yeah, not many. I mean, I think when I think about organization level feedback, oh, I see Marcy, she said yes. So we've got a few places where we've had a full org retro. When I think about the ways that a lot of organizations gather feedback at this level, it's often things like HR surveys, employee feedback forms, right? Where we're checking in and saying, do you still like to work here? And we're recollecting data, right? And so what I want to talk today about is how do we scale the feedback that we get from the teams up so that we're threading it all the way through these other retrospectives. Kind of think of like OKRs, right? The way we trickle down our OKRs, we want to do that the other direction with our retrospectives. So let's start with our team level feedback, right? For the team, we're looking about our small group behaviors and how we can drive change that's going to improve the way our team performs or delivers value. I have a very dear friend who in the last couple of years made the jump from a director of a preschool program to a scrum master. And a couple weeks into her first gig, she said, is it normal for developers to cry in the retrospective? She said, I had a developer fully start crying. And I was like, oh yeah. I've had people yell at each other. I've had tears. I've had people leave the room. I said they can get emotional, and I think that's okay. Like everybody is sometimes having a hard conversation with each other, an honest conversation with each other about how they feel about the work they're doing. And I think when you have a team of passionate people that are really engaged in what they're building, that's bound to happen from time to time. But I think what's important about this piece, when we think about the qualitative feedback that the team brings, right? This is about, burnout, emotion, exhaustion. It can be celebratory. It doesn't have to be all bad, right? Kudos for each other, appreciations. These are all the qualitative things that the team is going to bring together for this conversation, right? Of how they're feeling about their work. But what's just as important as the qualitative feedback is the quantitative feedback. when we think about this quantitative feedback, I think this is often missing from our team level retros. I have another colleague who called this the facts and stats part of the retro, and I love that. So kicking off with a couple key metrics. I usually like to review the same metrics at every retro. And I think that's a great way to ground the team in some reality, right? So it's like, if everybody's feeling burned out, if you can also show like we increased the amount of stories we did this sprint, or the velocity for this sprint over other sprints, or we were down a couple people this sprint because people got sick. So being able to ground your retro with some quantitative information, I think helps the team really remember what happened. The combination here is really the magic at the team level, right? Some feelings and some data. So how do you know that your process either, that the changes you're making had an impact to your process? Did you deliver more? Did you deliver less? And how can you link that, those different data points up to how the team is feeling? There is one downside, I think, to team level retros. And I think that it can be that we have almost too much local optimization to the detriment of other teams. And I see this a lot, I guess, less with like the product delivery teams and more with all those teams that tend to support product delivery, right? So we optimize, we want our team to be the happiest and deliver the most with the least amount of stress, right? So we help our team become kind of the star, but maybe we're pushing some of that stress to like an API team or a SRE team, right? Or ops. So we end up kind of moving that pain to other parts of the organization to make our team better. And I think this can be the downside, right? When we're so focused on how do we use our retro to really make our team the best? And this is where we want to start thinking about how do all of these things come together? Think of this as like a tangled web, right? Of dots for each team that we want to start to collect all of this together and look at the overall impact of those teams working together. So I'm going to call this system. I mentioned this could be program, portfolio, release train. Think of this as that layer in between, right? We're going to start to look at a collection of teams coming together. And how do we improve coordination and dependencies across those teams so that we're all delivering together? So in this case, like I said, we want to start to look at connecting the dots. I think the first piece of this is figuring out how you can start to share your retro output without breaking your team's trust. And I know that this makes all Scrum Masters very, very uncomfortable. I've had a lot of conversations about how do we do this without violating the team's trust. My experience has been ask them. So as part of the retro, when things start to come up and a team will say, we were blocked this sprint by maybe this other team because they didn't have their piece done in time, and we missed our date because we were waiting on their code. I will ask the team, can we share this? Can I take this information and share this with leadership or share this with the other team so that we can work through these things? I think that in most cases, teams are pretty comfortable having that conversation about where that information needs to go and how to help with it. And if they're not, they'll tell you no. I think you all know your teams probably well enough. They'll say no, this needs to stay in the room, but ask and try to identify those opportunities. When I'm bringing data out of these retros, I'm really trying to make sure that I'm helping the team see this as an opportunity to fix those big things, right? And connect those dots from other teams. I think the other thing that is really important from a system level is gathering data all the time. So one of the things that I think is very broken about a lot of the practices that we have at the system level, so that middle tier of retros, is when we do them, and I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say I bet for most of us it's like quarterly at best. When we do these retros, we get all the teams together and we recollect data. And we say, what's happening? Let's talk about dependencies. Let's talk about this release. And we ask them all this information. So we go back through the retro process again. 3 months is a long time. And as much as we want to remember all the stuff that happened then, there's probably going to be some highlights of things that were especially painful towards the end or right before the release that are going to drive that conversation. So I think the first thing you need to do at the system level is have a method for collecting data from those team retros that you can concatenate and bring to this conversation. That way you're looking at a real, full, complete picture of what took place over those 3 months and having, then connecting the dots, right, from team to team. You'll have a much richer conversation and a fuller picture of what's actually going on. So, oh, I missed one. So for this, I think there's 2 parts of this, bringing together priority and transparency. So we need that transparency of what's happening from the teams to be able to say, here's the key themes and problems, and then driving priority for the organization around those big things that need fixed. That question I shared at the beginning of, I had no idea how many teams were struggling with the exact same problem. And then having the CIO say it's such an easy, or the director say it was such an easy thing to fix. I think a lot of times you hear teams say that they stop doing retros or they get burned out on retros because nothing ever changes. It's probably because nothing leaves that retro, right? It's hard to fix that stuff if we don't, escalate it or have a conversation about how to fix those bigger patterns. And chances are, if your team's struggling with it, I bet another one is too. So next is this organizational level feedback. So this is how we want to take all of these different parts together and think about, how does this entire organization work together? Has anybody ever been in a retro with marketing or sales? That's fun. Highly recommend. Think about how interconnected what we do is with what salespeople need to do to be successful, right? Or to keep the business running, or same with marketing. Get these different parts of your business together for these retros. I think it can be fun to do like full value stream, right? Or product line, where you're looking at, for one part of the business, let's have everybody from customer care, who's answering the calls about what we're delivering, sales, marketing, get everybody together and do a full end-to-end retro where you can really see how things trickle down and move through your organization. When we think about these organization-wide retros, I think it's really important that you have a lot of visibility. I mentioned burnout from retros, as people feel like nothing's changing, nothing's getting better. This is a great opportunity for an organization to identify improvements. If you're using OKRs, fold these into your OKRs, right? Have an org-wide retro where you're tracking what comes out of that and tracking those improvements for the next quarter. And then have a way where you can report out on progress. So all hands meetings, or I'm a big fan of a Kanban board on the wall, right? Fold this stuff right into something where the whole team can see and the whole org can see what improvements you've identified and how you're working towards addressing those. And then own it all together. So I think this part's also so helpful in building a strong organization and understanding the impacts that one team or one part of your org may have on another part. And so that's, one of the examples I think we're probably all pretty familiar with is there can be some friction sometimes between marketing and engineering, and it's often date related. This is a great opportunity to talk through, like, how do we improve this together, and what impact does that issue have on other parts of the business? And then this helps bring everyone together, right? Then you're celebrating your successes, you're celebrating improvements all together, and not just as one small team. So this is really the shift from local optimization to global optimization. And what we want to start to think about is, how do we get this whole organization in identifying improvements, working as a group to put those improvements into place, and then creating a lot of visibility and celebration around when we see success with those. You'll probably also recognize this term. Basically, what we're talking about here is systems thinking. So this is a holistic approach that focuses on the way the systems parts interrelate and work together to contribute to the context of a larger system. So really, how are we all working together? So this is all great, but how do we do it? I think you need 2 things to make this type of org and this type of layered retrospective pattern work. You need frequency and you need volume. So let's go back to what we talked about here with our layers of this organization, right? We have our teams that maybe roll up to programs that roll up to a portfolio, and portfolios up to the organization. When we think about this, let's think about this in terms of frequency. So think of your team here and how frequent are their retros, right? What's the rate of which that feedback is provided? I would guess for most of the teams we're talking about, it's every 2 weeks. Maybe some teams are doing it monthly, some teams might be doing it weekly, but I think 2 weeks is pretty much the standard for your retro cadence. So we're doing those every 2 weeks, but then what happens up, right? So maybe you're doing an annual retro at the org level or quarterly at the system level in the middle here. A lot can happen in between there in that 3-month period or in that year-long period. So how do we make sure that when we're having these conversations of retros at other parts of the organization, that we're not doing them so infrequently that it's not enough of an opportunity to fix small issues that are happening every day, or that we're only responding to the most recent event. So we want to do this by making a big data pool. And so I mentioned, I think the first step in making a big data pool is having a great method for collecting all of the data from your team level retros. This can be really easy, and even Google Sheets is a great option here. I had one team that I worked with where we had a Google survey form where we just put in the sprint number and then 3 key themes that came out of the retro, like a positive one, a negative one, and something for change that came out of each retro. And that way, over the course of the quarter, we were pulling all this data from different teams into this Google Sheet. And when we went to do our system level retro or our program retro, we pulled this sheet up and we had 3 months worth of retro data here at kind of a rolled up level where we weren't disclosing any of the cards or any of the verbatim feedback that was coming from the team, but we were escalating up those common themes and patterns. And we were able to see all of that in one place, which is huge, right? To be able to say, maybe there are 8 teams inside this program, and we can see over the course of 3 months that a negative thing that kept coming up for everybody was that they were burned out and we're pushing too hard to dates. That's a super important thing to be able to carry forward into that system level retro. So how often does your feedback need to move up? This is going to be a different question for every organization, but my challenge would be move to more frequent, right? So there's lots of tools out there now to do these online, to make these a lot easier with everybody distributed. Have your system level monthly, right? Move away from the quarterly ones. You've got all this data coming in from the teams that you can pull together and start to review those more frequently. And then what if we do our org ones quarterly, right? Instead of an annual type of conversation. If we're doing these more often, we're giving ourselves more of a chance to address these issues that come up. The next one is volume. So I said feedback and volume, I think, are the two keys to success here. When we think about feedback volume, what I mean is the rate that the feedback is transferred. So think of like an electrical volume here, or just noise, right? Just the volume of your radio. When we think about volume, I'm thinking about how far does that feedback travel in the organization? Are you getting the right ears on it? Has anybody run one of the retros? There's a retro format where you make 2 circles. So you do your feedback and you talk about what you're going to change, and then you separate these into what's in our control and what's outside of our control. And I like this, except I ran this once and almost every sticky went to the what's outside of our control. And I felt like it was a really hard retro to not end on a really depressing note, because the team was like, all this stuff is broken, all this stuff needs addressed, and we can't do anything about it. And that's a great place to look for an opportunity for, these larger scale retros. So how do we get the right people's attention to hear this kind of feedback? I mentioned the concept of a retro recap. I think that can be a good conversation for Scrum Masters to have, but you have to be careful not to turn that into like a report to leadership, that the team doesn't get to see. And I've seen that kind of backfire too, where there's like a digest of the retro that goes up to leadership. And I think that violates the team's trust in some ways. And is also probably too much detail, right? It can be like you end up getting into a spot where there's like almost overreaction to small things. So I think there's a good balance to find there, and who's the right audience to receive this information, and how do we make sure that we've got frequency so they're getting feedback on a regular basis, but we have the right audience here to take action. I mentioned this concept of the black box, and this is what I always think of with our retros, right? We go in the room and we have these really amazing conversations about, you know, successes and failures and what's working and not working, and let's identify all these opportunities for improvement. And especially when we were all in the office, right, and we plowed through Post-it notes, you take all those Post-it notes down off the wall and they go straight into the recycling bin. And you have so much information there, right, about how your team is working and what they want to focus on. And that's all, that data is just so important to be able to use to help identify these opportunities for improvement and crossover in the teams. I've also used this retro into combining like retros with planning cycles, which is kind of how they do it in SAFE as well, if you've done the Inspect and Adapt workshop. I think having a good path around what needs improvement and how do you pull those into action is super important. So, you know, I mentioned either a Kanban board, having them show up on team boards. I've used like the giant Post-its that I see, I think behind Scott there, like you can use those to say, here's all the improvements we're working on as a team right now, and post them up in team areas, right? So it's constantly visible and everybody knows what that team is working towards improving. So think about who is the right audience here. You know, keep your team level retros to your team only, make sure that's still a safe place. But then think about how these retros, as you move up, need to have different levels of leadership involved so that they're really hearing what's going on for the teams. And I think it's amazing when you can get the C-suite involved in some of these conversations and participating in some of these retros so they can see how the teams are doing. There's often such a giant disconnect between what they believe is happening and what's actually happening for the teams. This is a great way to shine a light on what's going well or what's not. I'll give you guys a shameless plug here for Scatterspoke. This is an older screenshot here, but we built into the tool ways to escalate cards and promote cards up to your program or portfolio level retros. But I don't think, you know, like I said, use Google Sheets. Just figure out a way to keep all that data around so you can use that data to help make things better, right? There's so much wealth of stuff coming out of these retros that you can really use to help drive organizational improvements. So don't end up here where you don't know how many teams are struggling with the same exact problem. Really focus on themes and patterns and really driving home that frequency and volume of your retros so that you get the right audience and the right action. That's everything I have for you guys. Let's open this up. I'm curious. I know it's always, you guys are probably eating lunch or just finishing lunch, but if anybody is willing to to unmute and share a little bit, how does this work in your organization now?
I'll kick off if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's great, Scott.
So within our organization, one, thank you for this presentation. This presentation is awesome. It's giving me a lot to think about, especially when talking amongst our teams about different themes that we're all kind of struggling with. We don't normally have these discussions, but we will have every 3 months, like the entire department will get together and just have a kind of like a large retrospective where we'll pull ideas. But it's usually what's on your mind as opposed to pulling in themes that we're already kind of working on and going from there. On top of that, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, usually in that larger retrospective, you're dealing with about 30 to 50 other folks, and people start to feel hesitant about actually speaking up. So usually you'll have only 1 or 2, 3 people participating throughout the entire meeting, but a lot of people putting feedback and stuff on the board, and it doesn't seem to go very far. So.
Yeah, I feel like those big ones are funny. They can have like, I feel like they can take two different paths. One is like someone breaks the ice by saying something that everybody's thinking and doesn't want to say, and then everybody piles on. It's like, we don't want to go back to the office. And then that's all you're going to see is all these comments about how nobody wants to go back to the office. Or what you said, right? Where nobody's willing to break the ice and throw that first comment up there. And then you end up having a really superficial conversation about what's going on because you can't get to the meat of what's taking place. And I think, I think it's great to check in and ask everybody how things are going on a regular basis. But I think the downside of doing that, so let's say you're doing it once a quarter, about asking everybody, in engineering how things are going. I think sometimes it can be a little bit like, it's everybody's chance to complain about the stuff they don't like rather than to think about how to improve things. So when you think about how your team retros are phrased, right? We talk about what's working, what's not working, maybe not in that format, but you're driving towards how do we make this better? Sometimes those big ones where you recollect all that data just turn into everybody telling leadership, like, this is why you're bad at all these things, or this is why our org's bad at all these things. And it ends up just being really hard to steer the ship away from that really negative tone, where I think when you've got all that data coming from the teams, you've got good and bad, but it's also all focused on the improvement side of it and how do we make things better. So you've got so much great data there.
Hey, Colleen, question for you. So as far as escalating information and broader retrospectives, what recommendations do you have as far as the size of these meetings? Because, obviously if I have 6 development teams, 6 people a piece, I'm not going to get 36 people in a room and get a lot of good results out of that. Do you usually rely on, Scrum Masters and people to escalate and have other meetings, or do you incorporate team members and pull them up, into leadership meetings? What have you seen that works?
I usually try to get representation from each team. If your organization is big enough, one of the other things I like to do is to cross Agile coaches or Scrum Masters over to a different program or portfolio so that Scrum Masters can participate in the portfolio or program level retros. I think, sometimes it can be, we're in such a hard spot, right? It's like you're watching the same patterns day after day, but you don't get to be the one to call it out or to say, like, I have an idea for how we could potentially fix this, because you're trying to get the team there, coach the team to that idea or to that resolution. But when you get to the point where you're doing a retro with 6 teams in it, I think it's really important to make sure that the Scrum Masters all get to participate too. So I like to pull people across product lines sometimes or across portfolio lines to help facilitate those so that everybody can participate. I've done, I think probably the biggest retro I did had 60 people in it. And we did it in a room. We did it all in a room. And what we did was, we had key themes from so we had everybody bring their key themes and patterns from the last month, and we pulled everybody together, and then we did breakouts where each group took different themes and talked about possible improvements to make to those. And we numbered everybody off and then numbered the areas of focus for conversation, and everybody broke up and went to different parts of the, different rooms, and then came back and talked through identified improvements. And then as a group, we voted on all of them. I've done a similar format like that where I've rotated. So you have like 3 problems posted or three areas of discussion that you want to focus improvements on your flip charts. And I know there's a name for this. Maybe you guys can help me remember what it is, where somebody stays and somebody rotates.
Rotating flip charts.
Perfect.
That's what I call it.
Round robin.
Yeah, it's kind of round robin, but somebody stays so that you can say, like, well, Carrie was here, we said this, and then Carrie goes to the next one, and then Steve comes, and I tell Steve, like, okay, here's what we talked about last time. So you're keeping one common person at each station, and that can be a nice way to spread some of that around too. But I think the key part of kicking those off is pulling all that data together and identifying what do we want to focus on as an organization, and then crowdsourcing like the how.
Great idea. Thank you.
Did you give an example of themes that you're pulling from these retrospectives?
Yeah, I think the most, well, so I would say probably one of the more common tags or, themes to sort is people, process, tools, technology. Sometimes I see environment in there. Those are very generic, but can be like, it depends. If you're pulling retros from like an ops team, a security team, and engineering teams, you kind of need them to stay a little generic so that everything can roll up. And that's a nice place to start. I think depending on what the organization, like what frameworks are being applied, there are other things that you can focus on, right? Like pace, I think is a great one to talk about. Pace, delivery, workload, some questions like that I think are always good. I think depending on what you're using, if you've got like a health check tool, that's great data to pull in too, like the team happiness indicator. For Scatterspoke, we have a natural language analyzer. So it takes the card text and tells you if the card is more positive or negative in tone, which is kind of interesting and a little funny sometimes. It creates like a chart of, is the team trending towards more positive or negative conversation in their retros, which is interesting. But all of that data I think is great to pull together if you can. I'm going to stop sharing here too so I can see more of you.
Something I've had to encourage at any retrospective that happens, as a traditional sort of setup is you have to start with thanking someone else, because when you start getting invested in these situations, especially that the more critical and more chronic they become, people lose focus of we do actually help each other and not everything is a disaster. We do care about the work we do. So I actually have to start with you can't thank everyone. You can't say a team name. You actually have to call someone out by name. And if you do not know that individual's name, you need to go find out now, because if you don't, and I'm mired in, I call technical bankruptcy right now, that's all people remember and that's all they feel, not realizing that, because it's very hard to show, successes lately. And so, but you can say how we helped each other. Like we are still invested in supporting one another and someone did something nice for you, right?
Yeah.
It's different. It's very different from what you're actually bringing up, but it's a way of bringing that noise down so that not everything is a toxic situation.
Yeah, and I think, what's cool. So I worked with one organization where we made a kudos wall in the kitchen, like on the engineering floor. So we would take all the Post-its that came out of retros that were for other teams. I mean, even if they weren't, but it was especially if they were for other teams, and we would stick them to this kudos wall. Because a lot of times when you do that, it's like I'm with my team and my team is saying, we want to thank Brianna's team for doing, something amazing for us. And that never makes it back to your team. And so this is that can be kind of a great way to make sure that kudos and appreciations are moving around the organization. Like you said, I love that.
So this has been super helpful for me. Thank you so much for this presentation. One thing I'm really hitting home today is our retros, we have a lot of wins. We focus on the wins, but people have a hard time getting into the meat and potatoes of what's not working out. And I think it's because we are required to send a recap of everything to management up to the CIO. And so I'm like, that's what's killing our trust right now. Do you have like any strategies for kind of helping management let go and trusting the process, or have you ever encountered anything like that before?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I'm fiercely protective of the team level retro. Like it should be a safe space for them. And I try really hard to push that with leadership too. So I think you're spot on about they probably don't want to raise the things that aren't working well for them. Maybe you could come up with a working agreement with the CIO and the team to say, we're going to have a conversation about what's not working well, and then summarize that into key themes for the CIO. And then you're protecting their trust a little too, to say like, we want to have an honest conversation about what's not working. And then let's figure out how we want to share that outward, but what we talk about in here stays here. I think that's important for the team to know that. I think the other thing that can be a little hard with like the what didn't go well, and I always joke about like when your retros turn to being food related, everybody stopped kind of having a good conversation, because I feel like I've had so many retros where everyone's like, well, what didn't go well? Well, we didn't get donuts this week. We didn't have breakfast burritos. And it's like, okay, guys. And I think sometimes that comes from being in the moment again. And so I'm a big proponent of gathering data over the course of the sprint. So whether that's like a Jamboard, a Miro board, Scatterspoke, like whatever your thing is, have a place where the team can throw things up as they happen. And as a Scrum Master, do that for them. Like if something comes up in a stand up, throw a card on your board so that when you get in that retro space, you're digging into what happened over the last 2 weeks and everybody's not going like, I don't know, I wish we had more donuts, like, right? Because it like, you're not thinking about it anymore. We've got a Slack plugin, and I think a lot of other tools do too. So when I'm in Slack and if somebody says something, I hit like @Scatterspoke and send the card to the Scatterspoke board. So I'm just, all these cards are already there when you come in. And so I think sometimes that can help too with the what didn't go well, because then you've made notes of all those things over the course of the sprint and you're not asking somebody to kind of invent something.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I'm on the opposite end of what Kimberly is talking about. We only want to talk about chronic situations because we've been in them for a while. And the frustration we're having now is people don't want to participate anymore because it's a Fortune 50 company. We've gone through 3 CEOs, 4 CTOs in 2 years. And it's like, you know, when you've gone through that much change, you've power cycled most of the C-suite, you've power cycled 100% of the VP level in 2 years, that's all. They know there's problems, but they're not getting addressed. And so people, and you know, a new executive comes in and it's like, okay, let's address it. And it's like, we're fed up announcing what the issues are. And when it's just, and if you weren't willing to help us on the small issues, the roll small wins that everybody was experiencing, you're not going to get it, you know, resolved. And for example, we had a denial of service from a vendor yesterday that knocked out a good portion of the organization. And, you know, the executives are all enraged. I'm like, yeah, we all know. We knew. You didn't want to listen, you know, 3 CEOs ago. What am I supposed to do? Like we had all the answers, but you know, it was a small move. This one individual under another VP, you know, it's not even, you know, it's not even hard. It's just, it's a budget line item, right? You know, it's not even a big deal. And when that trust is gone, no one wants to help anymore. And it's like, yeah, you know, we're just spinning our wheels until the next C-suite executive comes in. So it's the complete opposite, and it's exhausting. Yeah. And getting that trust back, we're at the point it's completely gone. And every time we see that, this is what I'll close out with, every time we see, hey, you know, these surveys, it's like making everything look positive, and it's just like, that's not what we said on the survey. You know, you don't get a denial of service when something's going positive, you know, when there's all, you know, you can't tell me how great the customers have it when we know how bad it actually is.
Yeah, I have a local client that has just lost 20 people, some voluntary, some not voluntary, but in the matter of 12 weeks, lost 20 people. And then just won one of the Denver's Best Companies to Work For awards. And everybody was like, where'd this data come from? Just like you said, it was like talking to different people apparently. But I think, you know, that's where what you're talking about is where visibility is so critical to driving the action out of these. Like, you know, it's hard with everybody remote right now, but the more we can pull action items into your team's sprint, into a Jira board, into OKRs, into what, you know, if you're doing portfolio Kanban, whatever the mechanism is where you're talking about your work on a regular basis, make that those actions that come out of all these different levels of retros part of that conversation too, because they take work, like you said, like they need to be accounted for in your capacity planning and in your pulling, you know, what work you're pulling in. They're never free. They're rarely free.
You're not wrong. And you are saying that, you know, you are right to highlight that the pandemic makes this harder, but at the same time, when the problem existed before the pandemic, it's kind of like, you can't keep using the pandemic as an excuse. This was well before that, and we can document everything to show that this wasn't, you know, and we've got 15,000 less employees to handle that problem now. So like it gets much harder on the teams. You have to recognize, I think the issue that we're facing is people recognize the problem, but they're having a hard time swallowing it, and they're in such shock it's just not processing anymore, and so therefore we're stalling out, and that is a crisis, and it's we're going to be eaten alive, or something worse is going to have to happen before something actually changes. Things have to get worse before they get way worse before they get better. So
that sounds rough.
It's not fun.
Well, I know we're almost at the hour here. Any other questions or comments or anything anybody wants to share on how retros go in your org?
I had one more question, but I didn't want to take anybody from anybody's time.
I'd like to
Get in there,
jump in
Mason.
if I may.
Oh, Mason, your background is the best thing I've ever seen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I rather adore this. But so from my org, I'm with a relatively large and almost 100-year-old company that's based out of Illinois that helps put the radios and other things in places. So anyway, our retrospectives though have devolved into grouse fests, and it's just and the trust seems to have really withered away. What do you suggest on new approaches to trying to rebuild that trust? Because we've been a distributed team since before the pandemic, but I'd love to hear your suggestions.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two parts that kind of stand out. It's like driving the action, again, like what we were just talking about, I think is really important to feeling like that's a valuable use of anyone's time, right? When nothing changes ever, it's hard to keep the momentum there. So from an action perspective, I try to frame a lot of the action items that come out as like a hypothesis, basically, of, if we make this one small change, how will we know that it helped? And then using that, whatever we come up with is what do we expect to have happen? Well, if we make this small change, we think it'll improve this thing, using that as the thing that I bring into the next retro. So rather than saying like, and I'll take WIP limits for an example, like maybe the team says, we think if we increase our WIP limits, we'll be able to get more production defects done every week. And I say, great, okay. Well, rather than saying to the team, from an action item perspective, did we increase our WIP limits? Yes or no? I want to ask the question of, did it feel like we got through more production bugs in the last 2 weeks? Because that's what we were trying to change. That's what we're trying to fix, not did we do the action item. So I think that can be a useful way to frame the action items around what's the desired outcome, and then gives you something to focus on. Did we hit that outcome? But backing up to the safety part, and that's a really hard thing to fix. I don't want to understate that this is like, just do this with your sticky notes and everyone will be fine. I've done safety checks in orgs and teams where trust is really an issue. And here's the pluses and minuses, I think, of doing those safety checks. So I do, they're way easier to do online, but I've done them with Post-its too, where I have everybody just write yes, they feel safe continuing and having an honest conversation, or a no. And then you collect all the sticky notes. And if anyone says no, you stop the retro. You just do not proceed with it. And then the hard part and the downside of asking this is you got to do some work with the team. And I think it sounds like you may know that you would get some no's. I think what you have to think about is what activities would you put in place to help the team work through that. One of my favorite ones, and I used this with a team where I think I got 3 no's for 3 consecutive sprints. So we just did not do a retro. I asked people to email me feedback. And then that company had a part-time organizational design coach working with them who did the Myers-Briggs type testing. Although here at this place, you got a communication style and an animal, and I was a bossy beaver, which is really great, but, or in charge beaver, but translate that as you will. Okay. So anyway, she took the results of the team and made these quadrants where she said, here's your team, everybody is up here. I think the type was like owl. it was like an introverted owl or something. And she was like, everyone on this team likes to think about things, overanalyze. They're slow to act. They're slow to get things done. She was like, you don't have anyone on this team driving to action who wants to like check things off the list except for me. So it was also really interesting when we could kind of dig into people's communication styles, work styles. And then she facilitated some sessions for the team where we worked through, what does that mean, right? How I communicate is probably annoying the shit out of all of you. How you guys communicate, I wish you would talk more. So I think working through some activities like that, where you really try to build some empathy for each other, is a great place to start. And that might mean you have to skip a couple of retros to get there, but that's worth it, right? If you can rebuild some of that, I think. And it takes time, and it's not always fun.
Yeah, I'm trying to help there. Unfortunately, some of the toxicity comes from the lead developer, who's kind of a manager. And so, yeah, my goal is to try and help him be less toxic. Yeah. I'm going to try and help him realize his own conversation and communication styles, and try and help him to come back around and instead of seeing the company get rid of him, I'd like to see him become a bastion of trust for the team.
Well, and that in some ways, I think all the tools for retros help with that a little bit, because just like you've probably seen the thing that says if one person's remote, everybody should be remote, because it makes it an equal playing field, because then you don't have a room of 7 people and someone on Zoom trying to participate. I think with retros in particular, if you can level the playing field for how you're gathering feedback, especially like if you can get it in advance and then come to the retro with like, here's all the data I collected, we're going to go ahead and talk about it. Then everybody gets a chance to contribute and not get muffled by the loudest speaker, right? Or the person dominating the conversation.
Thank you. I am going to, especially since our time zones cover everywhere from the Ukraine all the way out to here in the West, I'm going to try getting advanced input and see if they take to that.
And there's, I'm a big fan of gathering that data up front too, especially when you've got teams that are struggling with some stuff. Like you think about, you have an hour together, sometimes less, right? If you spend 20 minutes of that hour trying to gather data, like you're just cutting down the time that you've got to do something about it. And so I like to try to get as much as I can up front and then give them a quick, like, let's vote, let's group, now let's talk about it.
Deal.
Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here. We are at the hour, so just want to say huge thanks to Colleen for being with us today and sharing that information. Really, really excellent.